The Magpie with Salt on Her Tail by Anna Wallenberg. Once there was a boy who was always wishing for things. One time he would wish very hard for a little horse to ride. A time he would wish for a sled or a boat, or even just a cheap clasp knife. But his father had died, and his mother was a poor woman who made brooms for a living, so none of his wishes ever came true. One day when he was busy wishing like this, he was given some good advice by a wise old man. The old man told him to go to the woods, sprinkle a pinch of salt on the tail of a magpie, and then he would get whatever he wished for. But he had to wish quickly, while the salt was still in the bird's tail, or else it would be no use. From that day on, the boy always went about with salt in his trouser pockets. He would set out early in the morning and come home late at night, and he saw many magpies, but he never could get close to any of them. Then one day he found a magpie that was friendlier than the rest. She let him come so close that he could almost touch her. But as soon as he stretched out his hand with the pinch of salt, off she flew and sat in the nearest tree laughing at him. She teased him like this all day, and when evening came the boy was so tired he threw himself down under a tree and closed his eyes and tried to sleep. But he could still hear the magpie hopping about in the undergrowth, and finally he heard someone call his name, "Ole! Ole!" The boy looked up and saw that it was the teasing magpie. "What's this?" he exclaimed. "Can you talk?"
"Yes, really, I am an enchanted princess, and you shall indeed have your wish, if you will help me. Get me a really fine clasp knife to clean my beak and claws, and I shall sit so that you can sprinkle salt on my tail."
Well, the boy thought that was fair, and the next day he went picking berries, which he sold, and did this until he had earned enough money to go to the city and buy a really fine knife. Then he went straight back to the forest to find the magpie, and opened the blade so that it would shine in her eyes. Immediately she came hopping up. She looked at the knife first with one eye, then the other. "Rubbish!" the magpie said.
"That is no knife for a fine princess like myself. It doesn't even have a gold handle."
And she flew up into the trees again. Ole felt so sad that tears filled his eyes. "I'll try to get you one with a gold handle," he said.
"No, thank you. I don't want a knife anymore. But you can give me a beautiful sled instead. That would be really fun to go sleigh riding this winter."
So Ole began to whittle breadboards and wooden spoons with his new knife, and did it so well that they were a delight to look at. He sold them quickly in the city, not even waiting long enough to carve a little boat for himself. In 6 months he had earned enough money to buy a splendid sled, and so he went back to the magpie in the woods. "Here's the sled," he called out boldly, for he was sure she would like this beautiful sled. Down she flew from her tree and perched on the seat and began to peck at the iron runners. She laughed loudly.
"Did you think this would do for such a fine person as myself?"
she said as she flew onto a branch overhead.
"No, it should have been made of silk and silver."
Ole almost cried in frustration. "I will try to get you a better one," he said.
"No, no," squeaked the magpie. "Now I want a carriage and horses, or else there will be no sprinkling of salt."
Poor Ole left with a heavy heart, but he had not given up hope. Whatever the cost, he would get the magpie her carriage with horses. He took the sled to a hill where the local gentry used to go sleigh riding, and there he hired it out to everyone who would pay well. He found many customers, for really the sled was the best to be had for miles around. Ole did not ride even once himself. Whenever he wasn't busy with the sled, he carved more beautiful things in wood with his clasp knife. At last he saved up enough to buy a horse. He trained the horse and taught it to do tricks, showed it for money until he could afford to buy another horse, which he also taught tricks. And soon he was able to buy an elegant little carriage with wheels that had silver spokes and an apron that had silver clasps. He braided the horses' manes, and put cockades in their ears, and gave them silver bits, and then he drove them off in the woods to the magpie. She was sitting on a branch, just as lively and skittish as ever. "Well, this is something," she said, when she caught sight of the glittering silver. She flew down to inspect the carriage, both from above and below, pecked the horses' backs to find out if they were young and fresh, and then she cocked her head. "I don't like open carriages," she said. "I prefer to ride in a closed one, and the horses should have been white, not brown." Oh my," sighed Ole, and sat down on a stone to think. A fussier woman than that magpie could not very well be imagined, but of course she was a princess. "Well," said the magpie, "I can see you are no judge of horses and carriages, so now if you want me to help you, you must give me a castle. It must be at the foot of a hill, by a lake, and there must be no fewer than 100 rooms, and a park, and a garden too." Ole sighed deeply. It was a lot to ask, but then he remembered he had his horses and the carriage, and began to drive people around the town. Everyone wanted to hire him out, for even if the magpie had not liked the horse and carriage, certainly it was the finest the townspeople had ever seen. Soon Ole earned enough money to buy another horse and carriage, and then another, and another. At last Ole had his own stable and was making money hand over fist. After that it was not difficult to build the castle, and within a few years it was ready, built of shining white marble with flags waving down from the towers. Ole went out into the woods to fetch the Magpie and take her to the castle. She tripped after him, hopping from room to room, looking into the kitchen, the pantry, to see that everything was there. When she had seen it all, she perched on the banquet table in the great hall.
"Oh well," she said, "it would all do but for one thing that is missing. There is 3 chests full of gold, without which I cannot maintain my court."
"For shame!" cried Ole, who had grown bigger now and was able to speak up.
"Otherwise there will be no salt sprinkled on my tail,"
said the Magpie, and she flew at the window and was gone. Ole had already achieved so much that he did not want to stop now, and besides, he had learned how to make money. So he worked hard for 5 more years until there were 3 enormous chests filled with gold coins on the floor of the banquet hall. He went to the forest to bring the Magpie to the castle a second time. As soon as she entered, she flew up to the chests, perched on the middle one, eyed the gold coins.
"Yes," she said, "that should do. You may sprinkle some salt on my tail."
The solemn moment had arrived at last. With a beaming smile, Ole put his hand in his trouser pocket and brought forth a pinch of salt. The Magpie sat quite still, and he sprinkled the glittering crystals on her tail feathers.
"Well, what is your wish?"
asked the Magpie. Indeed, what should he wish? Ole had been so busy working, he had completely forgotten what it was he had wanted to wish for.
1, 2,
said the Magpie. Just a moment, let me think." But for the life of him, Ole could not think of what he wanted to have.
3,
said the Magpie. With a flip of her tail, feathers flew up so suddenly that the salt fell off. Then she sat in the window and laughed at Ole until the hall echoed. You make me so angry," Ole shouted. "Now I know what I want. I'll buy myself a gun and shoot you."
"That would not be nice, little Ole," said the Magpie. "To shoot me after I have granted all your wishes, so that you have nothing more to wish for. Don't you already have a clasp knife, a sled and horses, a carriage and a castle and money? And all this without your having to say a word."
Ole stood there with his mouth and his eyes wide open. It was true, he already had everything he could wish for, and he had never even noticed. "Well, I declare," he exclaimed, clapping his hands in astonishment. "I worked so hard just to be able to sprinkle salt on your tail feathers, and it was all quite unnecessary."
"Yes, how do you explain that?"
laughed the Magpie louder than ever before, and lifted her wings and was gone. But Ole did not bother to try to explain it. He just settled down in his castle, and there he lived, well, all his days.